Lesson 123, percents and decimals. So yesterday we looked at percents and we defined percents as a ratio that compared a number to 100. So if we take a percent like 5%, we learned yesterday that you could write it as a ratio of 5 to 100 or 5 over 100. Those are equivalent, all right? 5% is the same as 5 over 100. And what we're going to be doing today is taking percents and converting them into decimals. Now, this is something we've done before, taking a fraction and converting it to a decimal. So it might sound familiar to you, but if it's not, don't worry, I'm going to go over it. So remember from our fractions unit that we could say this fraction or this ratio as 5/100ths. And 5/100ths is an important way to say it because it helps us remember our place value with decimals. So if I say 5/100ths, it would be the same as saying the decimal form of where we have a 5 in the hundredths place. All right, so remember this is the tenths, then the 5 is in the hundredths place. So all you have to do is think to yourself, we have a number over 100, we need that number in the hundredths place for this one. All right, so it's as simple as that to convert a percent to a decimal. Think about it as a ratio comparing to 100, and then say it, and then you write the decimal form of it. Same for 25%. You think about it as a ratio, 25 over 100. And since we have 25/100ths, we need to make sure that the last number is in the hundredths place. Okay, so it becomes 0.25. Same for if you have a percent that is actually higher than 100%. Think of it as 104 to 100. So we've got our ratio there. And just like the previous examples, we need the last number of that numerator to be in the hundredths spot. So what actually ends up happening is our decimal becomes 1.04 in order for our last number to end up in the hundredths place. All right, so that's why these things are equal. And I'm going to teach you a little bit of a shortcut so you don't have to do all of these steps every time you're converting back and forth. So this is going to be a useful visual for you. Whenever you have a decimal and you would like to convert it to a percent, all you are really doing is multiplying by 100. And then to go back the opposite way, when you're taking a percent and you want to make it into a decimal, all you are really doing is dividing by 100. So let's take a look at what that means. So we already know from the previous slides that 5% is going to equal 0.05, but let's use the visual. Okay, so when we're taking a percent and we want to convert it to a decimal, we are dividing by 100. So what you could do is you could take 5 and divide it by, oh, I didn't leave enough space. Let's put it farther down. Take 5 and divide it by 100. Now, 100 doesn't go into 5, so we have to add some zeros after a decimal. Remember, 5 is the same thing as 5.0 or 5.00 or 5.00000, means the same thing. So we're allowed to add those zeros as long as you put a decimal in. So now 100 goes into 500 5 times, but since we have a decimal here, we have to fill this in for the division to work. So you could do the rest of the steps. 5 times 100, 500 ends up with a remainder of 0. All right, so you end up with the same answer we got to by thinking about it in the ratio way, but there's a shortcut. Anytime you are dividing by 100, what you can actually do is take the decimal that we normally don't bother writing behind a whole number and just bump it back twice. This should look familiar to you, hopefully. All right, so you take the decimal, you bump it back twice, and then any empty bumps you fill with a 0. So this becomes 0.05, which is what we got when we were thinking about it as a ratio and also when we were doing the long division. But instead of doing the long division every time, it's much simpler to just think about it as bumping the decimal back 2 spaces. And this will work for any percent. So 25%, bump it back, the decimal ends up there. We end up with 0.25, just like we did earlier. For 104, bump the decimal back twice, it ends up there, and we get 1.04. All right, so that's a much simpler shortcut for you. You can just think if you're converting a percent to a decimal, you're just bumping the decimal back 2 spaces, which is the same thing as dividing by 100. Now, to go the other way, all you have to do is bump the decimal in the opposite direction. So if you have a decimal and you want to turn it into a percent, you simply bump the decimal to the right 2 spaces. So we end up with 50%. 0.5 is the same as 50%. Or for this one, bump it 2 spaces, we end up with 2%. Bump it 2 spaces, we end up with 123%. All right, so what we did earlier over here was just to help you understand why these things were equal. In your textbook, when you're doing your questions, you may follow the steps I showed you here, just using those decimal bumps. It's a shortcut that will make your life much easier and have you get to the correct answer pretty quickly.